let us begin by discussing the practical and the speculative. So you'll notice how the singular thing from which all following terms stem from is philosophy. So we start with philosophy and we break it into two sections, right? We break it into practical, and then we can break it into that which is speculative, right? So now that which is practical sometimes can be treated on its own, like in a vacuum. Same with that which is practical. That which is practical is more easily treated in a vacuum, generally speaking. So now the operation of that which is practical and the operation of that which is speculative is always intermingled. So that is the nature, that ongoing intermingling of these things is essential to being itself. So let me give an example of that to help clarify what I'm trying to say. So when a man goes to the store, right, he is physically there. He's operating physically. The physical nature of his body, the physical nature of his clothes, right? The neurotransmitters that are acting in his brain, that is feeding his vision into his active memory, I guess you would call it. I'm not sure what the neuroscientific term is for that, but I think you understand what I'm saying. But there's that physical entity that's occurring. Then there's also a mathematical abstraction of that situation. The most simplest one to point to would be time, right? So how long it takes him to get to the store, the measurement of that distance, right? So these things we don't physically have 10 minutes, right? We have an abstraction. We call that abstraction 10 minutes, just like we don't physically have 100 feet, right? Right, we will, if we physically have 100 feet, it is always accompanied by something that's existing, right? So we have 100 feet of a football field. That's 100 yards, so it'd be 30 yards. Or we have a 100-foot-long driveway or a 100-foot-long tree, right? So, that's how these two things are intermingling, the mathematical and the physical. Then there is the theological, right? The non-physical or the spiritual, right? So we can just immediately point to God, right? And the fact that God's desiring us to exist, right? That is how we describe, that is one way, that is the way that the mystical theologian, doctor of the church, Saint Bonaventure, describes the operation in a very general way of what God is doing to us to keep us in existence. He describes that operation of God keeping us in existence as God desiring us to be in existence. But that, that term is an interpersonal term, or I wouldn't say interpersonal, but it's an intermediary. It's a term serves as like an intermediary in a way. So, but that's more particular to how mystical theology is able to describe certain things in a way that structured theology cannot. So, but that is a discussion for another time. So we have the theological characteristics of God, intermingled with the physical characteristics of man, right? Intermingled with the mathematical abstracts, right, that are occurring around him, and those are our practical sciences, right? So now we have our speculative sciences, and speculative sciences are addressed towards the morals of the individual, right? The household economics or group ethics, right, involved with the group, and then the ethics of the state or politics, right? So in this situation, in terms of the individual, right, we can weigh in on he stops at the stop sign, right? He drives the speed limit. So individually, excuse me, in the face of society, he is doing the ethical thing, right? So he's exercising individual ethics, right? And those ethics are determined by the state, right? But they're upheld by the individual, right? And certain types of ethics, right, are held up in a way that it's not reflective of the law of the state, right? Such as certain social ethics. Like, it's not against the law for me to, and I'm going to use an extreme term just to really clarify my point. If I walk up to a black gentleman at a store and I address him as, "Hey, nigger," right? Just as you hear that, you become appalled by that. It is very ingrained in our social fabric, right? There's a social law ingrained, and that becomes ingrained in us to not do that, right? So if you call the cops, I don't know if they can, how far legally people, I don't know if you can call that a hate crime. I'm not sure. Maybe in some states or in certain situations, somebody could, there could be some sort of legality associated with it. I'm very unsure. So, because I've heard people white men use that term towards African American men in both a friendly way, in which way it was reciprocated, and also in a way that was more centered around discord. And but we have that individual operating with the state that's always intermingled, unless the individual is not under a state, right? Such as the man who probably maybe the most rarest situation where a man would be raised by parents or relatives who lived in an area during a time period where the influence of the government was far out of reach, right? They just lived in the middle of nowhere, and if any of them were to murder one another, like, nobody would be there to enforce that law, right? Or anything like that. Like, you couldn't run for help. You would have to travel for help, kind of situation. Anyway, right? So you have the individual acting in face of the political, right? In the state, the ethics of the state, right? And then in between these two, you have the group politics. Now, if this man lives alone and he's going to the store and there's only one person at the store, right, it's very lightly related to group politics, right, sort of thing. So, but I mean, the man, you could look at it so much as in this term where we can find it here, or in this scenario where we can find it, is in the interaction in which the man has with the person working at the store, right? If they are generally friendly to each other, if they are perhaps they know each other, right? Perhaps they are part of the same friend group, right? So even in that friend group, it's not so much household economics that played rather than group ethics, right? So household economics and group ethics are kind of interchangeable, right? In this term, like they're ambiguous, or they're similar terms. They're just similar terms. But anyway, if as the man is interacting with the store clerk, right, if there are things to be up to date on, like the individuals participating in each other's lives, keeping up with each other, participating in the conversation, giving justice to that, right? So that is good for the group ethics, right? So better group ethics leads to better states, right? Better group, and then also better individuals, and better individuals lead to better group ethics, which lead to better states, right? So generally speaking, so some things work more depending on the time and place and the type of politics, group politics in play, can very much affect this, right? So let's back up. So these 3 speculative sciences are occurring, right? So all these things, the playing field in which all speculative things occur is the practical, right? So you can't have these relationships, you can't have this, you can't have speed limits, right? Or adherence to stop signs. You can't have these things, right, unless you had physical things to make stop signs out of, unless you had mathematical abstractions in which to determine the length, the distance, the speed, theology, or in the theological things such as our intellect and the ability to reason and to communicate, right? And then ultimately, once again, returning to God, into God and the Trinity, and its and the way that functions, and all things flow forth from that. So let's talk about where things fit in here, and this will help clear the picture out more, right? So let's talk about let's talk about the science of psychology. So now there is a lack of a good definition of this science currently in the world of academia, or at least in Google. So, and I am not a psychologist. So I have read the turn of the tide where philosophy and psychology kind of met. I read a lot there. But I'm not going to dive into my qualifications. I'm rather going to allow the system to reflect how it is efficient in seeing these things. So in psychology, we see behaviors associated with an individual, right? So this individual expresses behaviors. So now those behaviors, right, take on a mathematical understanding, right, but one that is less numerically driven, but rather frequency driven, right, in a non-numerical sense, right, but in a partial numerical sense. So if somebody blacks out and takes all their clothes off and starts running through and runs across the street and back, right? And then they come back inside and suddenly they shake their head and they blink and they stop and they look around and they go, oh my gosh, what's happening? Why am I standing in the living room naked? So somebody experiences such an episode, right? Which they happen in such a way as well. Interesting enough. But if that episode occurs once to somebody, that can be a very different thing in psychology than if it happens to them 3 or 4 times in their life, or if it's happened very frequently, right, multiple times a week, once a month. I'm not right. So, but that gives I'm not sure where they classify things, but that frequency, that numerical frequency, right, or regularity is considered in psychology. So that's how it ties to mathematics, right? So it ties to the individual, and that it is the individual, right, that is showing these symptoms, right? You don't have like a we don't like have three people all come together, or two people come together to therapy saying, oh, we're unsure if we are a dual narcissist, right? So like a narcissist operates on their own, right? You can have husband and wives that are both narcissists, right? But they are not one narcissist. They are two different narcissists, right? You have a narcissist wife and a narcissist husband. You don't have a that narcissist couple, right? That is not a what would I call it? Not a that is not a that is not a that is not a condition, right? That is recognized in psychology. It is a narcissist individual, right? So, or schizophrenia. So you don't have a schizophrenic couple, right? You can have a schizophrenic wife and a schizophrenic husband who are married, right? So, but they are treated as individuals. So, when they are diagnosed with these things, they're diagnosed as individuals, right? So, now we know that physically it ties to that, as there are neural things that happen in the neurotransmitters of our mind, right? That can cause that to happen. Like these serotonin and dopamine receptors do very strange things, along with many other parts of the brain, when people undergo a psychotic episode, right? Or are experiencing anxiety or a panic attack. Or vertigo, or whatever, or that large list of psychological acute disturbances, or acute or chronic disturbances, so or sicknesses, so mental sicknesses. So and that's attached to that which is theological, because that which is theological gives us being itself. That always, right, that fact just always feeds in there. But it's also tied to our us theologically, as in the terms of sinful, what is considered very sinful behavior can lead us to these to results such as this. So there are neurological studies where they show that people that have many addictions later on in their lives, they start to the dividing wall between what they desire and what they choose to do only becomes less and less in height. So, and that this is why at nursing homes you have these old folks saying very aggressive, nasty, sometimes maybe like sexual things, or licking elbows and stuff. A part of that, sometimes these things are just kind of, coming out of, there's an interesting relationship there, so, in which I am not educated to speak on, but I do know that it exists. So, but we see that with psychology, right? We see how the psychology intermingles there, mostly. Now, psychology is related to the group, because the psychology of an individual can affect group ethics and the group approach towards a certain individual, how a family treats one of their children who may have schizophrenia, right? Or the state, welfare given to those who have, if someone is born and they frequently experience vertigo and this makes them unable to work, welfare is a system there put in aid by politics to aid this person. There's an interest by the state in the common welfare of the state, so to do that. So, and we can think of many other things. So there's our first one, psychology. Now let's think about a second term, which is an improper term, right? Let's think about the term Scientology, right? So So Scientology, if we look at the rough way that I forget the term, I forget the science, what they mean, the origin of words. But if we look at the structure of the words, we have science, right? Science, kind of alluding to science, and then we have our tology or ology, right? So tology can be teleology, right? Or it can be ologies, or simply ology. So teleology is a science of things in the direction that they are moving in the cause, right? The causal. So if we teleologically try to understand gravity or why a ball drops, right? We come to gravity. So if we teleologically investigate life itself, we come to the conclusion of God. So, right? But ology is simply the study of or the science of, right? So theology is the science of that which is non-corporeal, right? Where theo comes from, I'm not sure, right? So, but that's that which is non-corporeal, right? Physiology is the study of that which is physical, right? So, we can only think that mathematics means something different, right? I haven't looked into that, but I would only imagine that the way that word is wrote has something to do with what it applies to. So, but when we look at Scientology, right, this saying the science of how we get to studying things, right? The science of how we study things, right? So, or it is the science of studying things. So, if it's the science of how we study things, right? Well, you're kind of running a loop. It's like saying, well, it is so we have grammar, right? It would be what is the grammar that defines grammar, right? That would mean that, well, words didn't really mean what they meant, right? They mean something else. Now, in terms of like body language, tone, context, yes, right? But that is all part of grammar. Or that's not just strictly grammar. That's grammar and communication, right? It has to do with those two different things. So, and then there's a very large moral, individual ethic at play with how we choose to communicate things. So, but I digress. So, but Scientology it runs in circles like that. It breaks itself. And if it were to mean the other thing, the science of how we study things, right, that would mean to elude that that there is a special position in which things ought to be studied from, right? That is outside of their intended use, right? So that would mean that, well, if I rotate my microscope 3 degrees, right, in a perfect plane, I will get a different result than if I had not. Now, yes, you may be shaking the table as you rotate the microscope, right? Or you may be moving something else, but in a vacuum, strictly speaking, when that lens is faced in the exact in a perfect distance relation, a perfect rotation will not change how you see anything unless you rotate. But if you rotate it, you won't, right? So, but that's the purpose of that, right? The purpose of the best use is there's a singular best use, right? So for it to be the science of how we study things, that would just be like a replacement. That would be trying to replace the way that you ought to see things, or the way you ought to structure your thoughts, which is ultimately a natural way you ought to structure your thoughts, because we naturally adhere to wisdom, right? So if we seek it, and if we seek that which is good, because God is wisdom and God is all goodness. So I will quickly bring to the third point, theology of the body, right, which is physiological and theology, that kind of reveals to us that that our bodies and the way that we communicate with our bodies, such as body language, right, or in the in just the form of our participation and how they describe it as the noetic sphere of things, right? How that interacts, how much that participates with the physical, and how much you choose to participate in that, right? That is a theological movement, but the body itself is necessary for that theological movement, for that movement of spirits, right? Theology of the body does not apply to ghosts, right? It's only applies to real human beings. So, yeah, that's all I will say for that. So,